Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about lipids, and the main types found in foods are fatty acids, phospholipids, and sterols. The importance of these lipids we have already spoken about, so it's essentially associated with energy storage and production, insulation and padding, cell signaling, structural support, inflammatory responses, and hormonal production. So again, this is a refresher because we already spoke about lipids and their importance in previous lectures. So fatty acids, which are the simplest lipids, they can be classified according to the length of their chain. For instance, we have short chain that contains 2 to 4 carbons, medium chain contains 6 to 12 carbons, and long chain 14 to 26 carbons. Now, depending on the absence or presence of double bonds, they can be classified as saturated or unsaturated. An example of saturated is palmitic acid, and the notation for it is 16-0. It means 16 carbons, 0, no double bonds whatsoever. Unsaturated, an example is oleic acid. It has 18 carbons and 1 double bond. Therefore, the notation is 18-1. So, and also depending on the number of saturations, we can call them monounsaturated, and abbreviation is MUFAS. Example is oleic and palmitoleic acids. Or polyunsaturated, PUFAS, that they contain 2 or more double bonds. And examples we have linoleic and arachidonic acids. Now, depending on the position of double bonds within the hydrocarbon chain, we can name them using 2 different systems. One is the delta in blue, and the other one is the omega in red. So let's take a PUFA here as an example, linoleic acid. And we have the structure of the fatty acid here. So we have the carboxyl end. You can here see the carboxyl group that confers the name carboxyl end. And we have the methyl end on the opposite side. So on the opposite end of this fatty acid. So we can use these two, as I said, the delta or the omega nomenclature, depending on how we decide to look at the position of the double bonds. So in this particular case, linoleic acid has 18 carbons. This is well established. It has 2 double bonds. And if we use the delta system, we start counting carbons from the carboxyl end until the first double bond appears actually. So if we have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So carbon 9, we have the first double bond. And the second one, 10, 11, carbon 12, the second double bond appears. So for that reason, if we look here, the notation for this fatty acid would be 18 carbons, 2 double bonds, delta 9 and 12. 9, why? Because 9 is the first double bond, 12 position is the second double bond. So this gives us this notation using the delta system. Now, if I don't want to use this, or you want to use the omega system, I have to start counting carbons from the methyl end. And this is what we have in red down here. So again, we have carbon from the methyl end, we have carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So at the position 6 here, or carbon number 6, the first double bond appears. So the notation using the omega system then would be 18, because it's 18 carbons, obviously, 2 double bonds, but we only say, or we only mention where the first double bond appears. In this case, it's an omega 6. Why? Because the first double bond appears at carbon number 6. So this is all what this notation that gives you the number of carbons, the number of double bonds, but you only know exactly where the first double bond is located because it's what the omega-6 tells us. So 18,2 omega-6. So these are two nomenclatures that are often used. I would say the more common to find the omega system, because we hear a lot about fatty acids that are omega-3, omega-6, and what the importance of these fatty acids for health. So it's more common to find the omega nomenclature, even though you can get a lot more detail of the structure of the fatty acid when you use the delta nomenclature. And we also have what we call essential fatty acids. We already spoke about this. There are two of them. One is linoleic acid, which is the one that we just used as an example to demonstrate the delta and omega nomenclatures. So again, here we have between brackets the notation for these fatty acids. So 18,2 delta 9 delta 12, if we use obviously the delta nomenclature, and it's an omega-6 fatty acid too. And then we have alpha linolenic acid with the delta nomenclature or notation being 18, now with 3 double bonds at positions 9, 12, and 15 if we count from the carboxyl end. Now, if we use the omega nomenclature that we count from the methyl end, the first double bond will show up at carbon 3. So that's why it's considered an omega-3 fatty acid. And obviously they are essential because they are not synthesized by our body, so they need to be obtained through the diet. And the reason for this we already know, because humans lack delta 12 and delta 15 desaturases. So this enzyme is called desaturases. What they do is that they transform a saturated fat in an unsaturated fat. In other words, you add a double bond in a position where you have only a single bond, a simple bond between two carbons. So because we humans don't have the enzymes that actually can add a double bond at position 12 and 15 of a hydrocarbon chain of a fatty acid, then they cannot be produced. So for that reason, they become, or that what makes these fatty acids essential. Only plants actually have these enzymes that are capable of adding saturations or double bonds to positions 12 and 15 of a long chain fatty acid. Now, if you don't eat them, it can cause serious complications, and the most common are, or the ones that are often referred to, are retarded growth, dermatitis, which is inflammation of the skin, kidney lesions, and even early death can occur if fat is completely abolished from our diet. So it's important to understand that we don't want to, even though we often try to avoid fat as much as possible, even though it's not things are changing nowadays, but we have to keep in mind that fat is important because they have some very important functions in our body. So this chart actually lists all the saturated fatty acids that we find usually in foods, and also the unsaturated fatty acids. So the important thing here, nobody needs to memorize all these names and numbers. All the important point here I want to make is that if you look here, the saturated fatty acids, they all have, the notation is 14,0, for instance, for myristic acid, 14 carbons, no double bonds. Same thing for palmitic acid, 16,0. Stearic, 18,0, 20,0, 24,0. So these are just to show that you have fatty acids with different length of carbon chain, but without any double bond. So they are all saturated fatty acids, and they are found in animal and plant foods. So when we eat foods, we get a different combination of these saturated fatty acids. And the same thing is for unsaturated ones. So as you can see here, we have, for instance, now with the two nomenclatures, the delta and the omega ones. So if we look here, for instance, palmitoleic acid, which is an unsaturated fat, is 16 carbons and 1 double bond. So, and it's at the position 9 or carbon 9 when you count it from the carboxyl end. Now, if you were to count it from the methyl end, the first double bond or this double bond would be located at carbon 7. So that's why, from the methyl end, that's why it's called an omega 7. So same thing for oleic, 18,1, and from the delta nomenclature, it's the position 9. And it actually coincides because it's halfway in the molecule that this double bond is. So for that reason, if you use either the delta or the omega nomenclature, you're going to find that the first double bond shows up, no matter if you count it from the carboxyl end or from the methyl end. In both cases, it will be the first double bond will show up at position 9, and for that reason, it's called also an omega 9. And then you have omega 6, like linoleic acid we spoke before, alpha-linolenic, omega 3, arachidonic omega 6, eicosapentaenoic omega 3, and docosahexaenoic also omega 3. And as you can see, it's just a question of the variation in carbon length and the number of double bonds that makes them that affects the nomenclature, because you're going to have to establish either if they have the number of double bonds they have in what positions, and whether they are omega 3, 6, 9, or 7, depending on what you find. And again, these are found in most foods that we eat and distributed in different amounts, different concentrations, depending obviously on the type of food we are talking about. But the important point of this slide again is that we look at the notation for these fatty acids and understand the relationship between what is the delta, or what the delta tells us, and what the omega tells us, or systems of nomenclature tells us about the fatty acids. Now this this figure here is also another. You don't have to really memorize. There is no need to memorize any of this. What the important point again? What do we have here? So this divides the fatty acids into two groups, or the lipids in two groups. We have the upper half of this diagram that we show solid fats, and we have the lower portion of this chart that shows us the oil ones, or the ones that are liquid at room temperature, and the ones that are solid at room temperature. So the colors indicate, for instance, brown is saturated fatty acids. It's the composition of the fatty acid, how much is in terms of saturated, so it's the brown color. The orange indicates the monounsaturated fatty acids, and the lighter orange, or if you say salmon color, you have polyunsaturated fatty acids. And so what we can see here is the more brown we have, the more solid these fatty acids are, because usually when the longer is the chain of fatty acids, and also the more saturated it is, more solid it is also at room temperature, because saturation increases the melting point. So which means that you have to really increase a lot the temperature to melt them. So because of that, so at room temperature conditions, the fatty acids contain a lot of saturated. The lipids that contain lots of saturated fatty acids are the ones that are solid at room temperature. Note here that it says coconut oil, and that there's an asterisk here. The asterisk is actually just to indicate that even though we call them oils, but they are actually solid at room temperature. So it's just a question of, it's just to, it's the way, the common name that is given to this kind of fat, but in fact they are solid, they are not liquid. We also have here butter. Butter is a typical example, because we know that at room temperature butter is usually solid, and you see it's because it contains pretty much lots of saturated fat, a certain amount, a relatively small amount of mono, and even less of polyunsaturated fatty acids. And as we go down here on this chart, you see that the amount of saturated fatty acids reduce, and the mono and polyunsaturated actually increase. It's still kind of a threshold of distribution that maintains these fatty acids solid at room temperature, but then when you move to the ones that are down here, you see that there is quite a bit of polyunsaturated, less monounsaturated, and even less so of saturated fats. And for that reason, all this are liquid at room temperature, and these are true oils that you can use. Just an example here is most of them are plant derived, with the exception of salmon oil that is really rich in mufas and pufas, very little in saturated fat, and for that reason it's also a solid fat at room temperature. But everything else here you can see is from plants or seeds. Most of them are from seeds, and they're also called seed oils. So the important point here again is that you understand that the more saturation you have, the higher is the melting point. The higher the melting point, more they tend to be solid or more solid at room temperature. So, and as I mentioned before, there is a lot of conversation about omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids because there is a tight relationship or a close relationship of the amount of these fatty acids or the consumption of these fatty acids with certain or specific parameters of health. So why is it that we normally focus on the relationship between omega-3 and omega-6? And the reason is because they have opposing metabolic effects. Omega-3 fatty acids, if you consume them regularly, there is a relationship, there is an association with reduction in blood pressure and blood clots. There is a reduction in the risks of heart disease and stroke, and also improved defense against inflammatory disease. So omega-3 seem to be positive or have a positive effect or health effect because it's essentially associated with these three items that I just mentioned. Now, the opposite, conversely, if you look at omega-6 fatty acids, they can have a pro-inflammatory effect and be actually harmful. So again, they do opposite things. In general, omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, omega-6 are pro-inflammatory. And we now know that, for instance, cardiovascular disease, which is one of the main causes of mortality in the population, is associated with an increased inflammation, with an inflammatory response in our bodies. So if you use fatty acids that are pro-inflammatory, you tend to exacerbate that effect, or you tend to facilitate the development of diseases that are associated with inflammation. So for that reason, there is this idea that we should reduce omega-6 fatty acids in the diet and give preference to omega-3 fatty acids, because those are the ones that are anti-inflammatory and seem to be more associated with protective effect in the cardiovascular system and other inflammatory diseases, as opposed to omega-6 that can be pro-inflammatory and therefore be considered harmful. So this chart here actually gives us an idea of ratio of omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids in various foods that we normally eat. So again, no need here to memorize. The important thing is that we understand the concept of this of the foods that contain this ratio of omega-6, omega-3. And if you look here, we have all the different types of fat or oils, if you will. They are all on the left side. And then we have, in green, we have saturated fat. In orange, we have monounsaturated. And then the polyunsaturated fatty acids are divided into two groups. The gray is omega-6, and the blue is omega-3. Now, what we have here is the ratios. So the ratios meaning that you take the content of omega-6 and you divide by omega-3. That will give you a ratio. So what we want here, as I spoke before, we want to have less omega-6, more omega-3. So the lower the ratio, in theory, the better. So I have 4 red arrows that I put here. And the reason for this is because I just listed or pinpointed the ones that have the lowest omega-6, omega-3 ratios. And then if you look here is canola oil that has a ratio of 2.2. And then you have flaxseed oil that has a ratio of 0.3. meaning that you have quite a bit of omega-3 and very little omega-6. So the ratio is very favorable here. So if you look here, salmon also, there's 0.1. It's even lower than the other one, than flaxseed oils. And you see here that you have a much more omega-3 content than you have for omega-6. So the ratio is quite low. And then we have here, down here, we have butter. Butter is a ratio 1.6. And you can say, well, but there is very little omega-3 because the blue here is a tiny portion of it. But you have to consider that omega-6 is also very low. So the ratio stays within a relatively low value or lower range. So this is an important concept here, because we are talking about the ratios and not necessarily just the absolute value, because you may have more. For instance, you may have a higher content of omega-3. For instance, if you look at corn oil, it's the blue portion here is higher than it is for butter, but the ratio is 83 because you have so much more. The absolute value for omega-6 is so much more that it throws away the ratio. So again, these four ones, they just depict or pinpoint the ratios that are lowest for the different oils that we list here. And on this table on the right, what you see is the ratios for the most, usually the ones that are more frequently recommended for people to utilize as food, as sources of omega-3. If you look at salmon, it's in terms of grams, you look in 4 ounces of fish, you have approximately 3 grams of omega-3. And omega-6 is only 0.3. So the ratio is 0.2. It's pretty low. Mackerel, 2.2 and 0.2. So the ratio is 0.1. So swordfish, 1.7, 0.3, 0.2. Bluefish, 1.7, 0.3, 0.1. And sardines 1.8 and 4, and the ratio is 2.2. So you can see that this usually salmon is the most I would say mostly recommended fish that people for people to eat because it's rich in omega-3 and has a pretty low ratio with omega-6. So you're increasing omega-3 intake without bringing along lots of omega-6. So it's a common recommendation in terms of food, but you can also keep in mind that the other fish here, they are also pretty good in terms of maintaining the ratio. So before I move to the next slide, I just want to draw your attention to one particular oil, that is soybean oil, that is listed here, soybean. If you look at the ratio, soybean, it's 7.5. So you have lots of omega-6 and a relatively small amount of omega-3. So the ratio is pretty high in favoring omega-6, so more of a pro-inflammatory effect. So, and you'll see in a second why am I pinpoint only soybean oil from this chart. So the reason for this is because if we look here, we have a timeline, and starting from 1909, so early on in the 20th century, and going all the way to 1999, so close to the end of the 20th century. So now look here on the y-axis, we have the consumption of all these oils, in this case soybean, cottonseed, corn, coconut, and olive. So this vegetable oils here, so it's the consumption that we have here, and this is in kilograms per person per year. So going from 0 to 14 kilograms per person per year. So as we can see here, early on the 20th century, all the way to approximately 1960, 61, was very little. I mean, the consumption was relatively low of these vegetable oils. But there are two events that I want to point out here that really changed the way how we deal with this, or how people consume these oils. If you look here, it was in 1961 when the American Heart Association, they actually started to recommend that people take more mono and polyunsaturated fats and eliminate or reduce significantly saturated fat. And the reason for this is because there was this idea that saturated fat causes heart disease. So the American Heart Association actually put out an advisory about this, and what they said at that time was that you should avoid saturated fat and eat more unsaturated. And then you see that slightly after that, people started to consume a lot more of this unsaturated fat, but specifically, if you look here, specifically soybean oil. And look at the significant increase change that we see here. And this increase was even more pronounced, or it became really reinforced in 1980 when the United States Department of Agriculture actually released the dietary guidelines for Americans and told that they should, again, similar to what the American Heart Association mentioned in 1961, what the 1980 guidelines said was, okay, we need to reduce significantly saturated fat and let's eat more poly or mono or polysaturated fat. So that really led to a significant increase in the consumption of this vegetable oils, specifically here in this case is soybean oil. And you can see here that went from what, approximately close to zero, very low amounts here, and all the way to approximately 12 kilograms per person per year. So it's a massive increase in the consumption of soybean oil. And again, what is the implication of this? The implication is, going back to the previous slide, is that soybean oil has a ratio of 7.5. In other words, there's lots of omega-6, very little omega-3. So what happens is that with that increase, with this increase in soybean oil consumption, we end up actually increasing or displacing the relationship with omega-3 to a level that is way, way favorable to omega-6. In other words, we adopted or we increased the consumption of a type of fat that actually is more pro-inflammatory than anti-inflammatory. So some people would actually argue that this is one of the reasons why we have such a high rate of complications of cardiovascular disease in the modern and in the society that we are living now. And the reason for this is because we changed the eating habits, especially we kind of abandoned or eliminated a lot, or reduced drastically the intake of saturated fat and started taking in a lot of mono and polyunsaturated fats, in which the composition had quite a bit of omega-6 pro-inflammatory fat as opposed to the anti-inflammatory omega-3. So there is quite a bit of discussion nowadays about this, or the influence or the importance of this dietary change and how it affected health in the population. So the question that usually people ask is there an ideal ratio between omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids? So even though we know that omega-3 fatty acids seem to be beneficial, and omega-6 you need to keep it at a low intake. You don't eliminate omega-6, but you keep it at a relatively low intake. There is no, even though we know that, there is no scientific evidence that allows us to support any recommendation of food or how much you should eat based on ratio specifically between omega-6 and omega-3. What we know is that when you lower the ratio, in other words, you take more omega-3, less omega-6, it seems to be beneficial. So the consensus nowadays seems to be that people should just increase the intake of dietary omega-3 fatty acids to get the most potential beneficial effect from it. And I would say that you can achieve this in a more, I would say, effective way if you really choose those foods that have high omega-3, but you also pay attention and try to limit the ones that contain lots of omega-6. So this way you maintain a balance or a ratio that can be more favorable with an anti-inflammatory, with the anti-inflammatory effect of the oil being more prevalent than the omega-6 pro-inflammatory effect. So what does the Canadian Food Guide actually recommends? So it's usually 2 servings of fish a week. Fatty fish, such as salmon. Again, remember that chart that I showed where salmon has a very, very low ratio, in meaning they have quite a bit of omega-3, herring, and mackerel. So these are 3 fish that really contain a significant amount of omega-3. And the idea is to boost the intake of these fatty acids. And the recommendation also says that this should be grilled, baked, or broiled instead of fried. And why is it? Because when you fry it, especially if you deep fry fish, especially these fish that contain mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids, they are very, you cause oxidation in the molecule, and this oxidation end up producing or releasing molecules that can be really toxic to the organism. And then for that reason, you want to not fry them too much. You don't want to deep fry too much. And also because when you deep fry, you combine it with other oils, and the other oils that actually you fry them in may contain so much more omega-6 that you're actually defeating the purpose of eating a fish that contains omega-3. So you don't want to mix those different oils, especially if you're using soybean oil to fry a piece of salmon, for instance. You're actually, the amount of oil that you're adding to fry the fish, you're actually bringing so much more omega-6 that you're defeating the purpose of eating this high omega-3 fatty acid. Again, you want to try to keep it as low as possible, the intake of omega-6. So for that reason, grill, bake, or broil instead of fry. Now, it's very common nowadays that instead of using food, people say, well, I'm going to take a supplement. And there are supplements that are available, commercially available, where you can take actually capsules of omega-3 fatty acids. And this is the alternative often offered to people. So you have to be a little bit careful with supplements, because they may provide you, they give you the concentrated, more isolated form of omega-3, but it may lead to excessive intake because it's a concentrated form. And this may be associated with bleeding, may interfere with wound healing. And bleeding and wound healing are associated with inflammation and with the inflammatory and anti-inflammatory response of your body. So if you have, when you have an injury or any bleeding in your body, there is to some extent, the clotting process and the inflammatory response that happens in that region can be counteracted by the anti-inflammatory effect of the omega-3 that you're taking. So you might suppress that. The same thing with if you have an injury or a wound and you want to heal that wound, you need to have an inflammatory response in the place. So you don't want to suppress inflammation to the point that it becomes detrimental. So taking too much omega-3 fatty acids may lead to that. Also, another concern is that it may raise LDL. LDL here is the low density lipoprotein that is normally also called bad cholesterol. So it's not a very good name to give to this lipoprotein, but it's common, and that's one that is associated with cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, and for that reason it can be problematic. So there is a concern there that when you take too much, you may also increase LDL. It can also suppress immune function because the anti-inflammatory response or the inflammatory response of the organism is associated with some degree of immune activity. And if you suppress that because it's anti-inflammatory, you may also affect the function of the immune system. Therefore, the important message here is that if you're going to go with supplements, you have to be careful and monitor to make sure that you don't have any of these symptoms or any of these potential effects of taking too much omega-3 fatty acids in capsules. Always give preference to real food. You only resort to supplements when there is no other way or any other alternative that you can get through real food. Now, there is another group of fatty acids called trans. And normally we find only a small fraction in foods naturally, that occur naturally. And mostly in milk and meat products. But again, in relatively small amounts. So what is it that makes a trans fatty acid? It's a fatty acid that contains hydrogens that are next to the double bonds on the opposite side of the carbon chain. Well, it's by definition, but let's look at the molecule, because I think it's much easier to explain it, to understand this, if we look at the molecule. So here we have two types of fatty acids. Actually, it's the same fatty acid, but in two different configurations. The upper structure is what we call cis fatty acid, which is the one that is frequently found. It's the most abundant that we find in foods. What do I mean by cis? Look at here. You have the carboxyl end on the right, and we have the methyl end on the left. So if we look here, this is the carbon chain going all the way here from one end to another. But halfway here in this, we have a double bond. And you see that where you have the double bond, you also have two hydrogen atoms that are associated with that. So now you look here that they are both on the same side of the hydrocarbon chain. So they are all on the upper side of this chain. So what happens is that this fatty acid is called cis, and also at the position where you have the double bond, there is a bend or a kink in this molecule. So they are usually angular instead of being linear. Now, if you look at a trans fatty acid, what happens is that it's linearized. Again, you have the carboxyl end and the methyl end. And where you have the double bond, now instead of having both hydrogen atoms on one side, you have them on opposite sides of the carbon chain. So that means this is a trans fatty acid. That's what is characterized as a trans fatty acid. Cis means the same side. Trans means the opposite side. And again, this linearizes the molecule, makes it straight, or makes it linearized, or you don't have that angle anymore that you had in the cis configuration of the molecule. So why do we care about this? Because we say that there is so little in natural foods. Naturally occurring is such a small amount that we shouldn't really concern about. But the thing is, the food industry adds hydrogens to unsaturated fatty acids in a process called hydrogenation and make more trans fatty acid. And most of them is what we call partial hydrogenation. And partial because you don't want to, when you add hydrogens, if you break these double bonds, you don't want to eliminate them all, because if you eliminate the double bonds, you make a saturated fat, not a trans fat. So you have to maintain one or two double bonds in that fatty acid, but you want to have the hydrogen on opposite sides. So there is a very well-established chemical process that food industry uses to promote this hydrogenation and produce trans fatty acid. And why is that? Because when you use trans fatty acid, or when you add trans fatty acids to food, it protects fatty acids against oxidation. Remember, those double bonds, they can be very, very unstable and be attacked by oxygen, and this oxidation may disrupt and alter the structure of the molecule and make them rancid. Rancid meaning that the fatty acid has gone bad. So the taste is not good anymore, and it's not for consumption. It's not recommended anymore, and people change the taste so much that it becomes really impossible to consume. So, but what happens is if instead of using regular fatty acids, you use trans fatty acids, you protect them from oxidation, and therefore you prolong shelf life. So this is, from a commercial point of view, very, very convenient, because the food industry uses trans fat as a means to prolong shelf life. Not only that, if you make trans fatty acids, they become creamier, so they can be more easily spread on breads, on any other kind of food that you want to add. For instance, margarine is a typical example of that. Margarine is a type of fat that was hydrogenated, so it becomes more solid at room temperature and more creamy. So with that, you can not only prolong shelf life, but it's also more appealing to the consumer. So from a commercial point of view, there are advantages. The problem here with the trans fatty acids is that they have been associated, and nowadays I think there is quite a bit of very compelling evidence that trans fatty acids increase heart disease. And this has been attributed to the fact that trans fats, they increase LDL. Remember that I mentioned the so-called bad cholesterol. They lower the so-called good cholesterol, or HDL, high density lipoprotein, so they bring it down. They increase weight gain, so people tend to gain more weight. And not only that, this seems to be more concentrated within the visceral compartment, or in the intra-abdominal area. So it's considered visceral fat accumulation. And this is the nastiest kind of fat you can get, because this is the one that really associates significantly with cardiovascular disease, with atherosclerosis, with metabolic dysfunction, type 2 diabetes, and also seems to trigger some degree of inflammation. It seems to induce inflammation. Remember when we were talking about omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, we said that one is anti-inflammatory, the other is pro-inflammatory, and we said that inflammation is associated with cardiovascular disease. So this is another major issue here with trans fatty acids. So they also seem to induce inflammation, so they make people more prone to developing cardiovascular disease. So if you already have other risk factors you associate with a higher consumption of trans fatty acids, then it becomes you potentiate, let's say, the risk of developing complications. So nowadays, the consensus is that we should eat as little as possible. If possible, we could eliminate trans fatty acids. For sure, we should not be taking any foods that are processed, or foods that are usually sold as, or it's prepared and it's commercialized, and then the food industry uses lots of trans fat to make those convenient modifications in the food for commercial purposes. So usually it's not in natural foods that you should worry about, but you should worry in processed foods that are commonly available, that are abundantly used by people in general. So trans fatty acids, I think there is a consensus here. Get rid of them. Don't eat as little as possible. You don't need to worry again if there is very little in natural foods. It's more in processed foods that contain highest amount of these trans fatty acids. So the two last things I wanna discuss with fatty acids is that fatty acids, they make what we call triglycerides, and triglycerides are abundantly found in adipocytes, especially in the subcutaneous fat. If you pinch your skin, you fold your skin, and you are actually pinching skin, but also a certain amount of fat that is stored in your subcutaneous adipose tissue. And it's a form of energy. It gives you energy because your body can mobilize that fatty acid there. And it also serves as an insulation, because it keeps you kind of insulated from the environment. We have it under the skin, but we also have in the visceral adipose tissue that provides mechanical support for internal organs. And also triglycerides, especially the ones that we are getting from the foods, they serve as carriers of lipid-soluble vitamins. And example, A, D, E, and K. Remember those. So they not only they provide energy and support, or mechanical support, insulation, but they also serve as carriers for lipid-soluble vitamins. And ultimately, the fat is good, or triglycerides are good, because they confer taste to food, and they also signal for satiety, which is good, that you eat and then you reach a certain point where you stop eating. So there is an important signaling effect in terms of promoting satiety. So fatty acids, again, they make up triglycerides. So what are triglycerides? And by far, they make up the largest proportion of lipids that humans consume. So of all the foods that we eat, if you were to say, well, what is the type of fat that is most commonly found or most abundant in our diet? By far, triglycerides. Now, what's the distinction between triglycerides and fatty acids? So this is what a triglyceride is. So we have a backbone that we call glycerol. So you see the molecule here on the left. So glycerol here has 3 carbons, and they are numbered 1, 2, and 3 from top to bottom. And you see here that it has 3 hydroxyl groups. Now we have fatty acids, all those fatty acids that we discussed before. It can be short, medium, and long chain fatty acids, can be saturated, can be polyunsaturated, can be monounsaturated, all these different sources of fatty acids you get from the diet. So depending on what kind of food you're eating, you're going to get different combination of fatty acids. All right? So now how do you make a triglyceride? A triglyceride is exactly when you take 3 fatty acids of different compositions or different characteristics, can be short, medium, long, or double, with saturated, unsaturated, or whatever they are. What you're going to do is you're going to bind them to this glycerol backbone. So we make 3, what we call esterification. You combine the hydroxyl or the hydroxyl end of the fatty acid with the hydroxyl group of the glycerol. So what happens is that you release water and then you form an ester bond. And that's what we have here on a triglyceride. So you have here glycerol and fatty acids. 3 of them esterified to a glycerol molecule makes a triglyceride. And this is what you see here. You have 3 carbon 1, 2, and 3. 3 fatty acids bound to them. And these are 3 ester bonds. As I mentioned, you release water and you form an ester bond. In other words, carbon, oxygen, carbon. And you release, with this process, 3 molecules of water. So this is the type of fat that is usually mostly found in foods. It's the triglyceride. In other words, 3 fatty acids esterified to a glycerol backbone. So these are 3 ester bonds. When I say esterified, it's because it creates 3 ester bonds, as you can see depicted here. So triglycerides, they are again the form of fat that is, when you remember when we spoke about the adipose tissue. So when you store energy, you take these fatty acids that are separate from each other, you put them together in a triglyceride molecule, and this is what is actually stored in the adipose tissue. Now, if you fast, or if you stop eating for a while, you're going to mobilize energy again. So you go there, you take them off. You can take these fatty acids off the triglyceride molecule and you can use them for energy. That's why we say that triglycerides are good for energy storage, but also for energy production, because you can reverse this process in a process called lipolysis, that you break down the triglycerides, you separate the fatty acids, they get into the circulation, travel to any organ in your body, especially muscle, for instance, and there you can, liver also, and you can oxidize them and produce energy. That's the story with triglycerides. And just to give you again an idea of the energy yielding when you compare glucose and fat. So if you take 1 molecule of glucose and you oxidize it, you get 32. The net gain of energy in terms of ATP is 32. If you take 1 molecule of palmitate, which is one of those fatty acids, it has 16 carbons, you see that you get 106 ATPs. So the energy yielding is substantially higher, much higher, when you break it down or you oxidize fat than when you oxidize glucose. So your body tends to spare glucose because you don't have lots of it in the system, but and alternatively try to use or uses more so fat or fatty acids as a source of energy, because you can get a lot more ATP per unit or per molecule compared to glucose. So this is the energy point aspect of the fatty acid and triglyceride difference. We are going to discuss more in depth some other aspects and why triglycerides also play an important role in metabolism. So for today, we are going to stop here and we'll continue next, and we are going to talk about another type of lipid that is called phospholipids. But for today, that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.